I'm Dylan Sadowski. I'm the development team lead here at iSoft, and I welcome any questions people have about ITrack Pro or ITrack Enterprise. We'll save those for the Q&A session at the end, but my goal here today is to talk to you guys a little bit about some stuff that I think everybody will want to know for managing their ITrack and how to do it easily. All right, well, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So my goal today is I'd like to make sure everybody feels comfortable with the controls that exist in ITrack Enterprise and ITrack Pro for managing user accounts and security and access to the system. I'm going to show most of what I'm going to show inside of the ITrack Enterprise product, but most of the things that I say will hold true for ITrack Pro as well as Chromium, ITrack Pro Chromium, our mobile offering for ITrack Pro. I do have ITrack Pro open, and I can demonstrate things in there if people have specific questions towards the end. But just a note there. But so as you can see, I have ITrack Enterprise open. I'm logged in as administrator. A common thing that administrators need to do in ITrack is manage account access for either new users or people who are being given different responsibilities, or if anyone leaves the company or doesn't use the system anymore, correct access needs to be revoked from those people. So I kind of want to walk you through some of the main things you need to know and some of the tools that exist for making that process simpler so that it doesn't take as much time and effort. So here in ITrack Enterprise, we can go to Edit and then the Manage Users folder, and then User Permissions and Settings. This is the main place you'd go to for creating and managing user accounts, as well as assigning them roles and specific permissions. So inside of this dialog, you can see a list of the active user accounts. If you need to find inactive ones, you can uncheck this hide checkbox. So that'll bring other people back visible again. And you can, if you have a lot of employees at your company, you can use the filter box to sort into specific ones to find who you're looking for. So let's say, first of all, you need to create a new account for a new employee or somebody who has worked at your yard for a long time but hasn't used ITrack. Maybe you're creating them an account to use one of the mobile suites in the warehouse, or maybe they're a new counter person. So generally, you can either just click Add Account to start a new one, or a quick tip, if you have a pre-existing account of somebody who has store access, groups assigned, and specific permissions given to them that you want to kind of copy. If you have them selected when you hit Add Account, it will create a new user that has all that information copied onto them. So it makes it might make your life a little bit easier. But I'll also talk about how to manage those sort of things without having to do the copy process as well. But let's go ahead and create a new account. Call it webinar. So I'll give them a username and password, and I'm going to give them a work email. All right, so you'll notice the new account that I created is in the state pending activation. I'll get into what that means in a bit, but essentially at this point, you would probably say what stores they're able to log into. Obviously for single store companies, it'll automatically have the one that you're logged into selected, so you probably won't ever have to go over there. But for setups where they have multiple locations and you need to decide if a person is able to travel or log into other stores in order to perform documents or something, you could do that there. The groups thing I'll get into more, but that's essentially the ability to assign named roles to a user, and they can be a very easy way to create groups of permissions that you want to quickly assign to a person based on tasks and responsibilities that they have. And then in the permissions tab itself, you're able to give someone very specific overrides to their roles, or additional permissions, I should say. I'm just going to go ahead and make this user an admin. And you'll see over here what permissions that gave them as a sum of all the groups, all the roles that they have. So I'll just go ahead and we'll save that user. And with what I was talking about earlier, if you have someone selected and you hit add account, if you just don't have anyone selected and you hit add account, you can create a fresh user that will be blank and it won't have any stuff on it. So let's go ahead and save that. So that user exists. Right now I'll demonstrate what it would be like for that end user the first time they go to log in. There's sort of a first time login flow that if a user is in that pending activation state, it's sort of waiting for their first attempt. So if I try to sign in as webinar, even with no password, if I go to log in, it'll say this account needs to be activated, and essentially it will show them the change password pop up without having them have to type in the old one, because it's kind of a new one. So I could say, like, we'll just assign it test. Let's see. Oh, the last name of the account was test, so that's bad. It's telling me that's not very secure. All right, so we'll do test 2. So if I do that, then the user can now log in with that password. And if I log out and I log back in as the admin account, so that user now can use the system. And on the plus side, as an admin, I didn't have to assign them a password or a recovery email. They are able to do it themselves. So now as the admin, if I look at the webinar account, it's now active. I can see the last time they set their password, the last time they logged into the system. Let me just stretch that out a little bit, which can be useful for knowing whether or not users are following password change policies of the company, if you have any, and see if they've set a password recovery email. You saw when I was setting up my account as that user, it automatically filled out my password recovery email to be the same as my work email. They can differ. A lot of times users will use their personal email for their password recovery. They can use their work email too. Those might be the same. But essentially that is controlled by the end user to decide where an email is delivered to if they need to do a password recovery. And as an admin, I can help them out. If they failed to set a password recovery email, or it's a very old account that never had that set historically, and they lock themselves out or they forget their password, as an admin, you can come in here and hit set password to kind of help them out, force a new password onto their account so that they can get back in and then hopefully change their own password. So that's activating an account. What about deactivating people? What if someone leaves the company, or they're an external salesperson and they don't need access to the system anymore, or they're changing roles in the company and they're just gonna, they're not gonna be using ITrack anymore. If you click the delete account, if they've been created already, it'll just tell you all you can do is deactivate them. We can't delete them anymore, but I can say, go ahead and continue. But also there's this deactivate button here in the status management for an account. So if I click that, by default, it'll mark them as deactivated and it will give a default prompt to the user. And you can customize this. And let's go ahead and I'll log out and go to log in as that user. And you'll see that they're told that the account has been locked or deactivated, and they'll see the message that was entered onto that account. And that kind of thing can be important because you don't want to leave accounts out there with access to do privileged things in your system that no one's using anymore and no one should use, because it's just a possibility that, you know, given an unguarded terminal, somebody could do something with that. So that's the basics of creating and deactivating accounts. What about managing someone's permissions? In enterprise, there's quite a list of things a person can be allowed to do or not do. And obviously that is quite a lot to manage on an account by account basis, which you can do. Obviously, you can select individual users and grant them either no privilege, global, meaning at all stores, or store level privilege, meaning just at the stores they're allowed to log into. So for example, store level permission will mean that user could do it. Well, they have access to all stores, but if it was a user that only has access to store 1, then store level permission would mean they can do that at store 1, but not 2 or 3. Obviously, that distinction doesn't matter as much at single location companies, but obviously managing that whole list is onerous if you have if you set up a lot of accounts. So quick tips and tricks for doing that is that in this interface you can select more than one account and adjust those permissions. The blank ones, you'll notice that's because they're mixed on the accounts, but I can set them to a value. Anything they share will be shown. So I could make these all an administrator, give them all access to a certain store, or give them certain permissions. Like let's pick something. Maybe they all need to be able to manage customer options at their own stores. So that will affect all of the users that I had selected. So that can help for mass adding or removing permissions or groups from people. But I think even better than that is setting up a good set of roles in your system. And I'll kind of show you how to do that. Similar menu, if you go to the manage users and then user groups, there's a dialog where you can add what we call groups, but I'll probably refer to them as roles for the rest of this talk, because I think that's a good way to think about them. So at a company, generally users have a host of responsibilities, and because the world is messy, people generally overlap. And so what I think best practice is that if you have good role groups here, like counter person, maybe inventory manager, customer account manager, accounts receivable, maybe, whatever makes sense for your company, then because of the fact that a person, if they have multiple roles, they get all the permissions that all of their roles grant kind of added together. Summed up is the best way to think about it. So if they are both an administrator and a counter person, they have all the access that a counter person could have and all the access that an administrator could have. So for that reason, I think it's best to create very minimal sets of permissions for each role, and then a person would just get those added together as part of all the roles that they have access to. So for a counter person, for example, we probably would give them pretty wide access to searching and sales. So let me see, probably all of these, except let's leave out voiding, reopening finalized invoices, maybe editing closed sales orders. And we'll set all those as store level access. So you can use this drop down here to set everything that you have selected to a certain value. So you don't have to click on each one. So I'm going to go ahead and create a counter person one who has store level access to most of the sales order permissions. And then we should say, like, the administrator, on the other hand, yeah, they do have the ability to edit closed sales orders, and they can, let's give them the ability to globally void sales orders. If you're an admin, maybe you'd have a role that's like sales lead or sales manager or something, that who would have that responsibility rather than like a system administrator. It sort of depends on your yard, your company, how much things are broken up. A lot of times with ITrack Pro, one person does a lot of everything, and so they may just have all permissions, which is fine. But once you start to have a lot of individuals with splitting the responsibility, it's good to start to break things up. I see a question from Steve. Will we cover Pro? Most of everything I'm talking about here applies to Pro as well. I'm showing it inside of the ITrack Enterprise software, but roles, user management, first-time login, deactivating people, that all applies equally to ITrack Pro. And at the end, I'll show Pro as well. I do have it on my system here, and I can do a quick show of what the similar things look like, but most of what I'm talking about here will apply equally there. So yeah, those are, so I created a couple more roles. Now assigning them to people is done in that this user settings dialog that we were in earlier. In Enterprise, at least, those two dialogues are kind of combined in Pro. So let's say, for example, the support user and Tony and Jordan are all, let's make them all counter people. And so that put that on all three of those. Then let's also say that Tony is an account manager and Randy is an inventory manager and a counter person. And we'll say John is our accounts receivable person, maybe also sell some stuff. So the nice thing about doing it this way is that rather than granting John, Jordan, Kathy, and all these people specific permissions in this pop-up, they can get permissions just from their groups. So if we scroll down here to the sales section, you can see that it's already filled out for all these sales ones because he's part of the counterperson group. And if I toggle on the admin group, a lot of these other things that are global appear. And if I turn it off, they go away. This makes it very easy with one click to grant and remove swaths of access from an account. And another part about that that's nice is that in the future, updates to the system might add new permissions for new features or existing features that we broke up into multiple pieces. And the nice thing about that is that if you've already given roles to all of your users, instead of having to find the 5 or 10 people who need to be able to do a new thing, all you'd have to do is go in and change one of the groups. Like, let's say there's a new feature on the payment entry screen for doing your batch payments. And instead of finding the multiple people who might interact with that, sorry, I guess I don't know my alphabet. So instead of having to find all the people who manage that, you could just go to the group and say, well, everybody in that group, I'm just going to set those to a certain level. And that's all it would take. Now, all the people who are in that group now have that access, so you don't have to attach it or remove it from all those people. It allows you to more easily modify everyone in a role all at once. So I think that that's a useful best practice when it comes to managing your user accounts in the system. So I feel like that pretty much covers the board of managing user accounts, creating them, adding and removing access to them so they can log in or they can't log in anymore, permissions they can do or can't do, and then of course roles. So beyond that, what is there to think about as a user administrator or a system administrator? Well, the point of all the logins and the permissions and the access and stuff is, to a great extent, security, right? It's security of your data, security of your processes to make sure people who shouldn't be messing with stuff can't. But it's also to make sure that non-privileged individuals can't access your system. And part of that, one of the big ways people manage that is through the security of people's passwords and password policies. Depending on your company, you may or may not have any password policies. You may not necessarily care much about restricting access into the ITrack application, especially since historically a lot of companies had their ITrack server on premises, and the only way to access it would be to get into the building and walk up to one of the computers that have it installed. But more and more, for access, for ease of use reasons, clients are moving their database and their access into the cloud so that they can work from home or work from the VPN or work from the road. And this introduces the danger that someone might try to access things that they shouldn't from somewhere other than walking into the yard. So for that reason, we have added the ability as an administrator to configure sort of some security policies in the system. By default, they're pretty much all set to the most liberal state, essentially off to match what it was historically, but I'll show you various features you can turn on. And these are relatively new, so this should be news to a lot of the individuals. And what I'm going to show here is true in both Pro and Enterprise. They both have these same features. But if you go into the options configuration area here in Enterprise, if I type in security to filter this box, there's sort of two sections that come up. There's a couple settings for how login works, and then a bunch that involve passwords under the security category. I'll talk about these two in login first. By default, these are off, but what you can do is you can set a number of failed attempts before an account gets locked automatically. So this, if you set this, for example, to, let's say 3, the second number is the number of minutes that a failure counts for. So essentially what we have set up right here right now is if someone within 60 minutes were to fail to log in 3 times, then their account would automatically be locked. You could set this higher or lower, or the amount of time could be quicker. And essentially that would just be if it seems like somebody's trying to brute force a locked counter computer, you might want to lock that account out so that they can't guess it and get in. Whether that's something you're interested in is up to you, but by default, it's off. If a user gets locked out through this way, they would just need to speak to an administrator who could go into the edit users dialog and reactivate their account, and then they could get back in. So it's not it's not too onerous to handle if that's on, but whether users, if your users have trouble typing their passwords, maybe that might be annoying for you to have to unlock them too much. But so that is one feature that the system has. And then there's this set of policies here under the security section. They mostly control security with regards to how often, if ever, do people need to change their passwords? How far back does it remember previous passwords? Restrictions on the kind of passwords they can enter. By default, it's mostly all off. So, there's a lot of things in here, and probably what somebody, if you don't already have a policy, a corporate policy on access and password rotation, you might be asking like, well, what is a good thing to set it as. And we do have some best practices, some modern suggestions for what are a good level of security that shouldn't get in the way of your users. Often people think that long, complex passwords with lots of numbers and characters and hashes and stuff is the most secure. But a lot of times, what's most important is something that is easy for a user to remember, but still sufficiently complex. The easiest way to accomplish that is something called passphrases, which is usually several random words. A lot of times people prefer to they would have like one word like password, but they'd replace the A with an @ sign or something. But actually hackers, that doesn't add any more security. Their programs can totally handle that. It's too predictable. But a random sequence of words like ladder, transmission, door, there are a lot of words, and that's relatively easy for a user to remember and to type in. They're common words. They don't need to have a lot of underscores and @ signs. It's still very secure. So from a policy, so mostly that's a training thing. There's nothing super different about a passphrase versus a password. I would definitely not suggest setting a maximum password length. Some systems do that, so we have support for it here, but probably setting a minimum length is a good idea. If you really want, you can require a minimum number of different character classes. And I would definitely turn on the common password blacklist. So this would essentially, if a user tries to use one of the top 10,000 most common passwords, it's going to say no, because those are the first things that any access program is going to try. So that would lock them out of things like, password with any random character replacements. But in the end, forcing people to change their passwords so often or have such complexity that they have to write it down on a sticky note and put it next to their monitor takes you a step back in security. And so what's most important is dialing it in for your users, making sure that they know how to use something secure like passphrases, and that everything is set up to require some minimum level of security, and it's something that they can remember without having to write it down. And whether you choose to do password rotation, like requiring them to change it every certain amount of time, is up to you as a company. But in general, that just leads to people either reusing passwords, which doesn't improve security, writing them down, which doesn't improve security, or just picking more common ones, which doesn't improve security. What you really want is to allow people to pick one very secure password that is not shared with any other system, that they can remember and they don't have to write down. So that's a tough needle to thread, but that's kind of where you want to be. So, and I know that I talked about a lot of stuff there, and it could be a little difficult to remember, but we're going to send out a document after this with some of what I talked about there in best practices, so that you don't have to memorize it. So don't worry about that. Let's see. So that is the security preferences. Oh, sorry, there was one little one in there that I think is different than password security that I should probably talk about real quick. Oops. And that's this session setting for a number of minutes of inactivity before locking the user session. By default, this is off, but if you set this to a certain amount of time, like let's say 30 minutes, then if a logged in account, which a lot of times people just leave ITrack open and logged in at their computer all day, which is fine. What will happen is if after that certain amount of time, 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever number of minutes goes by and they haven't used their mouse or their keyboard at all, like no input was detected, it will just go ahead and automatically lock their session. It won't close ITrack. It won't close any of their open documents or unsaved work. It'll just gray everything out and pop up the login dialog and says, you know, the person who is logged in needs to type in their password. So it's just kind of like if you use the Windows lock my account feature, where you don't lose your session, but it's currently locked from anyone using it without logging back in. So that can be useful no matter what you set all your password privileges to, just because that can be if somebody was going to do try to steal any data from your system, that's usually the easiest way, is just through social engineering, finding a computer that's just unlocked and is logged in with privileges. All right, well, one last thing I want to talk about is just what if people forget their password and they want to go through the recovery, you know, I forgot my password, what do I do? Obviously, they can talk to an admin who can set a password for them, but then the admin has to think up a strong password. And I think we all know that if the admin sets the password for the user, they're probably not going to change it from that. So you're either going to have to give them a temporary one that will probably become permanent, or you'll have to think up good ones. So let's say I was that support user and I forgot my password. You can click this forgot password button and it'll pop up this this recovery dialog, which let's see. Oh, that one has Tony set up as the thing, and I don't want to have to get into his email. So let me use this one. Say I forgot my password here. So I'll just go ahead and click email recovery code, and it'll say right there that it was sent to the recovery email address. 1 second, let me get into my email and I will show you what that looks like when you receive one. Switch what I'm sharing here. All right, so as you can see here, I got this email from password.recovery@isoftdata.com, and it has instructions saying that the user account Dylan began a recovery process, and it gives me a special code. These codes are random, and as it says in here, it'll only be valid for 30 minutes, and it's only useful once. So, and this is sent to the recovery email, which presumably they have good security on. And so no one should be able to use that to access another person's account. But that's another reason why a lot of times we would suggest people using their own personal email accounts for recovery email address versus a work one, because those can be shared. And so you don't want to create a scenario where one user could perform a password recovery for a different user if they have access to that same email, because then they can gain access as that user by doing a password reset. And you wouldn't want someone who's not an admin to be able to gain access as an admin and run a lot of cost reporting or other things that you don't expect that user to be capable of normally have the privilege to do. So in the pop-up here, that code I copied to my clipboard. I can paste it in here as my old password, so that the recovery code works instead of having to remember your old password, and then I can type in something new. And so then if I click OK, it should go ahead and set my password to that. And it was just test in this case. So I should be able to log in with password test. So there we go. That was sort of the password recovery process. I didn't have to bother the admin. The same feature is present in ITrack Pro. I think starting in version 12, if I remember right. So if you're on a version that doesn't have that yet, please go ahead and talk to support, and we'll make sure that you get updated to version 14. And then one last little thing, if a user wants to change their own password once they've been logged in, under the actions menu, there's a change my password, which pops up and asks It's really the same pop-up. Type in your old password, type in your new one, confirm it. And if there was anything, if any of those password rules were present, and I typed in something that was not allowed, it would tell me the why of it down there. And as you saw, we had rules for password length, not reusing some of your previous number, like X number of previous passwords, character restrictions. We also have a database of the top 10,000 most common passwords that can be excluded so that people don't use weak passwords. We also even have a feature that can securely contact an API that notes passwords that have been part of data breaches so that people could avoid using those. And that can be set to either be a warning, like a warning that was in a breach, or as an actual stop, like no, don't use any passwords that were in data breaches. So that, I think that pretty much rounds up the total of what I want to talk about today. And I think that should hopefully give people here the familiarity they need with the security options and the user account options in ITrack, to be empowered to be an account manager on their own system. All right, so in ITrack Pro, similarly, if you go up to the edit menu, but you'll just do edit users, you get into sort of a simpler combined dialog. Pro has fewer permissions to select for a user, but you can add new users up here. You can deactivate them by unchecking this checkbox on a given user. And this group section is very similar to what I was showing in Enterprise with roles, and you can add a new one. Like let's say we wanted to add a counter person role. The way that it works is if you select it and you hit this configure button, then you can pick what permissions you want to be part of that role. So let's say everything on quotes is part of it, and invoices. And then if you click configure again, it kind of goes back out of that mode. So then I could pick a user, like let's say Matthew, and you can say they are a counter person, and that gives them the roles that it would have if you would have just checked them directly. So it's the same idea in Pro. And similarly, you can edit global preferences settings, and you'll get to that exact same dialog I was showing where you can manage the security settings. Similarly, you can set, if you don't see a lot of the password permission settings in here, they'll usually get created the first time someone performs a password reset. So if you're not seeing them in there, you can just go ahead and I'll just all right, so now if I go into the settings and I look at the security options, there are a bunch more options. So beyond that, there is a setting I didn't talk about previously, but you can set a number of days before. If you want to have passwords expire and have a password rotation system, you can set a number of days between a minimum number of days, or sorry, I guess I'm saying it wrong. A maximum number of days they can have the same password. So that can be set here. And if you do have that set, you can say 3 days before they expire, I want them to get an email or get a pop-up when they log in that says, hey, you're going to have to change your password in the next 3 days. So just a way to make sure they know that it's coming up and they don't get themselves locked out. Because if they wait until afterwards, they have to change their password in order to keep using the system.